With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Welcome back to Heard Tell. I'm Andrew Donaldson. It is July the 7th. That's a Thursday in the year of our Lord 2022. And this is going to be a special edition of Heard Tell because we had breaking news overnight into the morning with the time difference. We've been covering the events over in the UK. Prime Minister Boris Johnson. We had a great discussion on yesterday's Heard Tell program with Albie Amankona about the situation going on. Well, it popped off. Apparently, there are reports now that Boris Johnson will be resigning. He's going to try to just resign from the party and stay on as prime minister until his replacement is named. Now, that's up in the air whether that's going to happen or not, or if they're going to push ahead with trying to force him out. So still a lot of pieces. So we're going to do review. We always talk about accountability on this show. We're going to do a little accountability ourselves. We're going to bring back three of our guests and how we here at Heard Tell have covered this. So you can listen and hear what we've said, what we've got right, what we've got wrong, how we covered it, and now that it's here because we did some prognostication, how close did we do? Bill Bowkett will be on the program, Albie Amankona will be on the program, and the great Alys Watson Brown will be on the program. All of these in the last few months as we've covered this story. Listen, make up your own mind, and we'll continue to cover it. Special edition, UK Boris Johnson version of Heard Tell right after this. Heard Tell. Okay, it's been a minute. She hadn't been here since March. Thrilled to have her back, our friend from over in the UK. Alys Watson Brown has returned to Heard Tell. How are you, ma'am? Glad to have you back.
I'm really well, thank you. I'm fresh out of university. I've finished my degree and just kind of recover from it and have a good summer and just chill out, I think.
Yeah, it's got to be a good feeling, doesn't it?
Yeah.
While we're on the subject, we talk about people moving around the UK. Y'all got yourself a rail strike going on. For the American audience, because the culture is different, mass transit is a much bigger deal in the UK than it is here because we're such a much bigger country, more spread out. There's two sides to these things, of course. There's the practical side and there's the political side. Just give us both. Practically, what is this rail strike doing? And politically, what is happening with it?
Well, practically, it's stopping millions of people from getting around the country and getting to work. And it is basically a protest in the context of inflation, cost of living, the fact that public sector workers in the UK haven't received a pay rise in line with this huge, the inflation crisis, whilst MPs seem to have increased their pay rise around $2,000, I think, in the last 2 years. So there's that kind of inequality. And then politically, in the UK, the trade unions say we're going to strike. We want the government to give us what we want. We want more rights for our workers. We want more pay for our workers. And it's basically trying to emotionally blackmail the government through, emotive language in the way that, it's workers versus, the elite and the state. It's this, you can tell what their political motivation is. And it's incredibly disruptive. Whether you support it or deny it, no one can say that it's not disruptive. And what's interesting, though, is that people usually, if a rail strike pre-COVID would happen, people would be mad taking taxis everywhere. Everyone would be walking to work, cycling to work. But now you walk through the streets and it's really empty because people have started working from home. And especially it's a really sunny week. People don't want to be going to the office. They'll just say, I'm just going to work from home. I mean, my family have done that. So whether the effect it has is going to be as widespread and as sort of felt by the consumer this time is up for debate. But the popularity of commuting by car and working from home, as I said, could well see passengers now just desert railways and never to return, especially given that, they're not nationalized in the UK. So prices can really vary. You can pay £200 to get a train to Edinburgh in Scotland when it's cheaper to fly there via Paris. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and of course the backdrop here is interesting and the timing is really interesting because You have, front page of the Times today, UK inflation hits 40-year high. Cost of living is dominating the headlines. It dominated prime minister questions this morning. This is something that's affecting absolutely everybody. So the question, of course, is, and I'm not against unions as a rule, but strikes are about timing and strikes are about public sentiment. That's really what a strike is for. Everybody's hurting right now. This may not be the time to fly that flag of, hey, we want a little extra, when these folks are probably doing just a little bit better than folks in the Midlands or in the outs parts of the country where, number one, this doesn't affect them as much. And number two is they're going to watch it on TV and go, what are they thinking? Everybody's hurting here. Is that fair, or is that the common sentiment?
I think that is definitely one way of looking at it. And in a way you could be right. However, I think they have timed it possibly quite well, because everyone is hurting right now, as you said. And what better way to go up against the government and all this inflation and this grievance than to support a very disruptive anti-government protest. And it's not just the rail strikers, the rail workers and their strike. Teachers are threatening to strike, nurses. So all across the public sector, there is this there's this impediment between the rulers and the workers. But I suppose one way you could spin this, which a lot of people might disagree, is that this could be good for Prime Minister Johnson, because it distracts the press anyway from anything to do with Partygate, anything to do with the latest palaver with his wife, Carrie Johnson, any misdemeanors in his office that have really undermined opinion of him, specifically within the Conservative Party. So maybe this could be a uniting factor for the Conservatives and, take tension away from, the leadership election and the vote of no confidence. It depends on how he handles it. And currently how he's handling it is ostracizing the leader of the opposition, so Sir Keir Starmer of the Labour Party. And the Labour Party, it's the most interesting, I personally think it's the most interesting party in the UK. They used to be the parties of the trade unions. Their leadership elections, their internal structure used to be so heavily dominated by the trade unions and their leaders, and how they could really choose which leader got elected and how much influence they had in drafting policies. And Sir Keir Starmer hasn't said anything. He hasn't been clear about it. And the fact that he's not made a clear stand when his MPs are out there on the picket lines really speaks about the state of the Labour Party right now. So Johnson really could use this to his advantage to present a united Conservative government.
Well, let's talk about those Labor folks for a minute, because now I'm an American, so just go real slow and use small words explaining this to me. Maybe when you put the U in Labor, it changes things. But we had a really interesting scene with the Labor Party where you have Keir Starmer and the leadership and the front bench telling the back bench that they shouldn't be seen on the picket lines. Yeah. Now, I'm not exactly a Labor supportive, but if you're the Labor Party and there's a Labor strike, that seems like something that would be in your wheel. I just kind of shook my head. I'm like, that doesn't even make sense. What are they doing over there?
It's a symptom of a wider identity crisis within the Labour Party of this country. And I think social democracy in general, obviously Labour had its great sort of decline and fall after Gordon Brown and the financial crisis, when I don't know if you know the term Keynesian economics. So that was sort of the alternative economic model to capitalism or neoliberalism, and Keynesianism fell, and sort of Tony Blair created this third way, and that obviously built a rift between the more traditional Labour supporters. And Tony Blair also didn't try to incorporate trade union influence into his party. He didn't redact the infamous policies of Mrs. Thatcher regarding their ability to strike. And since then, they've had no economic policy that can appeal in the way capitalism does. And they've also got this legacy of just being bad with the economy. They always have. They always seem to screw it up. You can't just tax and spend. People understand that now. And there's, as well as this now in this age of identity politics, there is this very common question now that I would say more right-wing commentators always ask Labour MPs when they come on air. They go, can you define a woman? And most of them can't answer. And that's driven away a lot of people. It's fundamentally a crisis of identity. This writer called Patrick Diamond has written far better than I can explain and in depth on this. So if you want to know more, do look him up. He's very good at that, explaining why.
Yeah, it's a universal problem. We're having the same thing over here with our, even inside our Democratic Party, which is our left party. You have the center left, and then you have the Social Democratic wing that's getting more and more progressive, and they never the twain will meet, apparently, except when there's an election to be had. It's the same thing, and it's more social and economic stuff. It's really interesting how universally, how much of this, since you brought it up, how much of this falls on Keir Starmer? Now, to be fair to the Labour Party, they've bounced back from the Corbyn years and the disaster that was. They did decently well in the recent local elections. They did pretty well, especially in London, places like this. So it's not the house on fire, but at the same time, a lot of people are looking at all the problems Boris Johnson's having and then looking at their own side up front and going, man, we should be doing better than this against what Boris Johnson's doing. A lot of Labor folks have been saying those sorts of things. Is that all far on Keir Starmer, or is Boris Johnson just that Teflon? Where's the mix of those two meet?
I think Sir Keir Starmer hasn't been a force of personality. He hasn't brought a spark or a fire to the way he speaks. He keeps missing open goals. There were so many criticisms that he could have weaponized during COVID. And I think that was the big thing for his leadership. People didn't know what he stood for, apart from just saying, oh, this policy is too late or this policy is wrong, without actually saying what he would bring to the table. But you could argue that, in this sort of economic situation, especially, Jeremy Corbyn, a leader like that, a figurehead, a motive, populist figurehead, could be what Labour would need to win an election. Not that I'm saying, it would be good, but I think he weaponized the anti-austerity narrative incredibly well. He mobilized the youth vote incredibly well. And it doesn't look like Starmer really is doing that at the moment. Obviously, we're regarding the cost of living and things like that. He's not stirring the masses in the way that Labour can. And as we were going back to the identity crisis, it's happened throughout Europe in their social democratic parties as well. And it's a trend. It's a very interesting trend to see, since 2008, all these social democratic parties in the center left kind of fracturing. And then I suppose with you as well, you have the Nancy Pelosi's and then you have the AOC's, and they don't necessarily mesh well, but one of them has to catch up with the other at some point.
Yeah, Alys Watson Brown joining us. Okay, so just how big an issue is the cost of living crisis? It's obviously, front page. It's obviously dominating social media. You're there, we're not, though. Turn the noise down on the news and tell us, just on a practical level, is this what everybody in Britain and the UK is talking about? Is this the dominant issue of the time right now for folks over there?
Yes, it's gone from changing the way you go to a supermarket. I'm a student and notoriously I'm poor, right? And my sort of £25 a week food budget was my big thing. And it was my shop. But now what I would have to do is just kind of fill my basket up with the essentials until I hit my budget mark. And then I just couldn't buy any more because that was it, right? And luckily I'm in a position where, I have a very good home life and my parents were able to help me out a little bit. But there are a lot of people who aren't. However, right now, the weather's hot, people are happy, people can go out and they don't need to worry about heating their homes because families are choosing between putting the heater on and putting meals on the table, which is horrible. And it's not just that, it's petrol. It's going places, and if people can't afford to go out and buy their Starbucks coffee because they have to save money, or buy their pastry on the way to work, that means the workers in those cafes and in those restaurants are losing out as well. It's a never-ending cycle of pretty much just depression. I suppose the news in some way doesn't necessarily over-exaggerate this. It's true. You see it everywhere. And it's the supermarkets especially are all competing on their save money on this deal, on that deal. And there was this huge story about the government were going to ban 2 for 1 or buy one get one free on ready meals in their in their aim to tackle child obesity. And they decided not to go forward with that in the cost of living crisis because, any food's food, right? You need to feed your kids. And yeah, some people don't have a choice. And, it caused a lot of backlash, but actually, sadly, that's what it's come to. But yeah, that's from my perspective as a young person. And even more annoyingly, I coming from London, have to pay like £7.50 for a pint of lager, and it doesn't make going out that fun.
Yeah, that's $10 for those of you from Logan that aren't up on the pound sterling conversion to US dollars. That's an expensive drink. Alys Watson Brown. One last political question, and we're going to switch gears. Boris Johnson, he seems to just, oh, it's over. Oh, it's not over. Oh, it's over. It's not over. Now we had the Lord Gate thing. We've had the ethical stuff. We've had the Kerry stuff over the last week or so. But he doesn't seem like he's really going to be going anywhere. I know there's a little bit of election fatigue. There's no clear-cut replacement for him. Those factor in as well. He just keeps squiggling out of these tight spots and pressing on ahead. It's kind of remarkable to watch, really, isn't it?
I think the last point that you said is probably the most influential of the fact why he's still there. There is no real alternative replacement to Boris Johnson. There's no real forefronter. I mean, there are whisperings about MPs, sort of red wall anti-lockdown MPs. So people like Steve Baker, who wanted to lead the COVID recovery group, but their only political message is, I was against lockdown. There's no kind of philosophy about them as there is with Boris Johnson. And I think also Ukraine, he's been praised personally by Zelensky for, our solidarity and our help for them. But he, I guess he just seems to keep going. And whilst I've fallen out of love with him many, many times, I would see no one else who I would vote for. But Boris Johnson is a man who is desperate to be liked. And if he left office, he wouldn't leave office in a crisis. He would leave because he wasn't elected, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. One of our UK friends kind of put it this way. Because I asked him how bad we knew the Partygate picture was eventually going to show up because that's just the world we live in, and he kind of made it half joking, but it turned out too he's like that view of him walking through Kiev outweighed that Partygate picture. He's like, you watch, and sure enough, it did. He was right. All right, Alys Watson Brown, we're going to switch gears. We've been banging on the Brits a little bit. It's her turn. She's going to take a shot at our government, and specifically the FDA. We'll talk a little America with our friend Alys Watson Brown over in the UK, late of Bristol, but she's done with them now. We'll be right back. More Heard Tell right after this. Okay, very excited about this guest. Been wanting to get him on for a few weeks, but he's a very in-demand, busy feller, but we're thrilled to have him with us. Another Young Voices contributor. This is a very smart man. Put him in your information rotation. I've really enjoyed listening to him, and I'm thrilled to talk to him and now call him a friend. Albie Amankona, how are you, sir? Thank you very much for joining us here on Heard Tell.
Andrew, it's good to be here. I don't know whether to say good morning or good evening, but it's good to be on the show nonetheless.
Yeah, as we're recording the afternoon in the U.S., it's evening in London. It's been a very, very busy news day for the UK, so let's just start right there. We were going to talk about it anyway, but in the last few hours, we've had some breaking news. Again, we're recording this, so if you're listening to this on Wednesday morning, these things may have changed, but we've had some very high-profile resignations. For the American audience who doesn't understand what a chancellor of the exchequer is and these sorts of things, these two gentlemen that resigned, who are they, first of all, in the government, and why is that a big deal that's kind of changed the narrative on this a little bit?
So the two gentlemen that have resigned, I'll start with the Health Secretary because that's probably relatively easy for an international audience, but the Health Secretary is in charge of the NHS and healthcare for England, and then also social care as well for England. As he essentially runs the NHS, was instrumental in the sort of the response to COVID and a lot of the COVID regulations and the rules that came in place after Matt Hancock had to stand down last summer for the affair that he had with one of his advisors at the time. So that's Sajid Javid, who was the Health Secretary. He was actually also previously Home Secretary and previously the Chancellor. And then he stood down, Sajid Javid stood down as Chancellor and Rishi Sunak took over as Chancellor. And the Chancellor of the Exchequer is essentially the person that is in charge of the Treasury, which is in charge of things like taxation, things like government spending, and essentially has the purse strings of the United Kingdom. So two very powerful figures over the past 2 years in charge of the COVID policy and the COVID response.
Yeah, and for the visual, if you watch Prime Minister Questions on Wednesday morning, the last couple of weeks, these are the two guys that sit right beside Boris Johnson. That's who they are. To the outside observer, when you're having crises and things like this, these are both ambitious men. Both of them have been named for, a future in politics. What part of this is the current crisis? Because let's be adults here. They're not really learning anything about Boris Johnson. They don't already know. They know this man very intimately over a number of years. They've decided for their own self that they need to step away and separate from him. So how do we parse that out in the visuals of this and also in the politics of it?
My personal view is that I think it is unlikely that either of these two gentlemen would end up as a real serious contender for the leadership of the Conservatives, for the leadership of the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom. Sajid Javid has actually already tried a few times and didn't get very far. And Rishi Sunak was involved in quite a serious tax scandal earlier on this year with his wife's non-dom status. She had basically a tax status that wasn't entirely in the United Kingdom, and because she is the daughter of a billionaire, that was a lot of money that she was saving, and that was seen as quite a big blow to any future leadership bids for Rishi Sunak. So I actually do think that these men have done this for moral reasons rather than to further their own careers. And in fact, in his resignation letter, Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, acknowledged that this might actually be his last ministerial position.
Does that give this heft? Because let's go to the guy who does have the job that this is all centered around, Boris Johnson. It's just been a drip, drip, drip this year. He'll have a high moment, and then we have a personal crisis, usually somewhat self-inflicted. Let's just be honest. He'll have a high point. He'll get out of a scandal, and then another scandal comes. Is this going to give more weight than the last one? Because we've done this Boris Johnson resignation watch before. We've done it a few times. The British press is treating this like it's a lot bigger deal and more imminent. You're there, we're not. You tell us. Does it feel like that to you, that this is different this time?
I would always be hesitant to predict the downfall of Boris Johnson, but this, to me, it does feel different, because what all of the other scandals were missing were these big cabinet resignations, and the Chancellor of the Exchequer is essentially the most important cabinet position after the Prime Minister, and the Health Secretary, because of how important the National Health Service is in the United Kingdom, is also a very important cabinet position. To have both of those resignations literally happen within minutes of each other, Andrew, they were announcing both of these resignations, is quite a big blow. But there is nothing constitutionally which forces a Prime Minister to resign after cabinet ministers actually, resign themselves. So what some people are thinking is that he could hold on until the 1922 committee has its elections in a couple of weeks' time, and what we think might happen with the 1922 committee, which is essentially like a trade union of the Conservative Party, is that it could elect essentially a bunch of rebels to the executive who could change the rules on when votes of confidence rather can happen, and then it could usher in a vote of confidence before Conservative Party conference in October.
Yeah, Albie Amankona, join us. Break this down for the American audience or the international audience a little bit, though, because this is the parliamentary system. So Boris Johnson is the leader of the party, but he's also a member of the parliament. So in order for him to go, if he's not going to resign on his own, which everybody close to Boris says that's his ultimate nightmare, he does not want to resign in disgrace. if he decides to fight this, there's a lot of process involved here, because basically what you're doing is the party is trying to take itself back from him being the leader. This isn't like the American system with the president, where, you know, we've never removed a president from office through impeachment. We've had him impeached but not convicted. There's a lot of dirty processes here that are kind of unclear and kind of uncharted territory, really, if he decides to really fight this, isn't it? Because if he doesn't want to go, it's going to be hard to make him go, isn't it?
Yes, it will be hard to make him go, but the Conservative Party has always been ruthless when it's come to getting rid of its leaders. So the process that would happen if he chooses not to resign is there is a committee, as I said before, the 1922 committee, which is essentially like a trade union of backbench MPs. Now, the 1922 committee has an executive committee, which is in charge of all of the leadership rules in the Conservative Party. Now, at the moment, confidence votes can only happen once every 12 months. And there was a confidence vote just 2 weeks ago, which would mean under current rules, there cannot be another one for 12 months. But there are elections for the 1922 committee executive coming up. And the rebels essentially want to hijack those elections, elect in a bunch of MPs who want to change the 1922 committees so that a vote of confidence could happen before the 12-month period, and then usher in a new vote as quickly as possible. And then if he were to lose a majority of Conservative MPs' support, he would be ousted as Prime Minister, and there would be a leadership election.
Yeah, and the other option here that some have been talking about is they think it would be a desperate move. Would Boris Johnson call a general election and take his chances?
So this is something which I've heard periodically over the last couple of weeks. It is actually something which the Prime Minister has denied. It would be a very high-risk strategy, Andrew, because the Conservatives aren't doing too well in the polls. It's not sort of a 1990s level of polling disaster that we saw with Tony Blair and Sir John Major, but we are, a good 7 or 10 points behind Labour in the polls, really quite consistently now for a couple of months. So it wouldn't seem to me to be an electorally prudent decision to go to the electorate right now to vote in a general election. We've already had many since Brexit, really, since 2015. I think there have been 3 general elections, and we don't need a 4th one.
Yeah, Albie Amankona joining us from over in the UK. Crisis reveals things. Crisis brings pressure. Pressure reveals fault lines. How much of the political stuff that's going on in Parliament, and to be fair here, the Labour Party has not exactly been covering themselves in glory either, although Boris is going to get all the headlines because of this. It's been kind of a mess the last few weeks. How much of this is the crisis, the cost of living crisis? Every time we talk to our UK friends over, they're like, oh no, this is all anybody's talking about is cost of living. There is some international stuff. Northern Ireland's a mess. At some point, is there a feeling in England that the government, Boris Johnson's line has always been, we're going to get on with it. We're going to get on about the business. He's done that to that point. Does it feel like the government is kind of grinding down and getting under the weight of all this? And with the cost of living crisis, that's just so much more pressure, and that's bringing a lot of these fault lines out.
Undoubtedly, the biggest issue facing the British people at the moment is the cost of living crisis. We've got inflation at 9.1%. We've got fuel prices spiraling out of control. We've got gas companies not passing on the government fuel duty cut onto consumers. People are really feeling the punch. And to the government's credit, they have actually come out with quite an unprecedented package in support to the British people. A lot of people argue that there's not necessarily a conservative way to handle a cost of living crisis by essentially handing out money to people. People like me would perhaps prefer tax cuts, but nonetheless, no one can argue that the government isn't at least trying to solve the problem. But all of that, Andrew, is being overshadowed by the way that the Prime Minister and indeed Number 10, supported by the rest of the cabinet, respond to what can actually be quite simple events that just require a good response from the Prime Minister and a good response from the government, and none of that seems to have been happening.
Why is the comms on the small things? And I'm not meaning small as in trivial matters, because these are serious matters, but he does good on Brexit. He had that wonderful optic of him walking around Kiev. He seems to get the big stuff and get in the mainstream of the British people on a lot of that stuff. And it's just self-inflicted wounds on all this other stuff. Like, just come out and say the truth about, like, Partygate happened. Everybody went, okay, there's going to be a photo come out at some point. Like, everybody kind of felt that one coming, self-inflicted over and over and over again, letting this minister, and I don't want to get into the allegations because they still got to go to the process, but, ministers that are problematic hang around because you needed the votes, and that's the way it looked. Why is it just part of his personality, that big outward personality, that he just sometimes doesn't handle this small stuff? Because it's almost baffling. Yeah, this is part and parcel with who Boris Johnson is, isn't it?
I wouldn't necessarily describe them as small things. I would probably describe them as things which should be easy to handle. It should not be difficult to handle a situation where an MP has allegations of sexual assault against them, which are then upheld. It should not be difficult not to promote that person to a position where they're essentially handling the pastoral care of Conservative backbench MPs. That should be an easy thing to handle. The Partygate saga should have been, in my opinion, an easy thing to handle. It just required honesty. And what a lot of Boris loyalists will say is he's got all of the big calls right. But when there are so many of these easy things to handle, which are handled abjectly terribly, it piles up and it ends up in a situation like this where we've got two senior cabinet ministers resigning. And I think this all actually stems from the Patterson scandal last year. So this has been going on since around October or November time last year.
Yeah. Albie Amankona joining us. That's why we have him. He says it way more elegantly than I did and got to the point much better for my bad question. Well done, sir. Appreciate that. Join us on Heard Tell. We're going to take right after this break. Yeah, Bill Bowkett joining us from the UK, another great Young Voices contributor and a great commentator in his own right over there. Make sure you're following him. One of the things, the speculation was that Boris Johnson has somewhat rode out the trouble he has is because there's not a clear-cut successor to him in the Conservatives, in the Tories. Is the same true with Keir Starmer? If he holds to this and he steps down, is there a clear-cut successor? Or could we be in a situation come the next general election where both parties are kind of scrambling for leadership at the same time?
That's certainly the case. I think, at least in the Tory party, there are several possible contenders to step into number 10 Downing Street. You've got the Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, who's been centre stage in negotiating a way out of the Northern Ireland Protocol. She's also been integral to making all these post-Brexit trade deals with countries like Australia and New Zealand and other countries. Whereas with the Labour Party, there's a bit more open scope for who to take over. I mean, but the problem there is that even with American listeners, it's the same with British listeners or British people, is that there's not really any standout figures. I actually looked recently in the most recent YouGov polling into the most popular Labour figures. That's not just MPs. It could also be mayors like the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, or former prime ministers like Gordon Brown, Tony Blair. And I think it was only Yvette Cooper, who's the shadow Home Secretary, that came out as the highest current sitting member of Labour's front bench, and she was 7th. I mean, on top of my head, there's people like Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, who's a very eloquent speaker, very moderate. Lisa Nandy is the Shadow Foreign Secretary, and she's very tough when it comes to the Uyghur Muslims in China, and also criticising the government's levelling up strategy to make Britain more equal, more fairer, more financially prosperous. But the problem there is that ask any normal member of the public, to name, 10 members of the Labour shadow cabinet, you'd really struggle to probably list half, list 4 or 5. So there's definitely people who could take over Starmer, but they would also have, an extremely difficult job in not only, resonating with the British public, but also, creating a vision which they see as moving on from 12 years of Tory rule, especially since the Tory party are now moving further left on economics, since they've introduced all these tax rises around national insurance and VAT. It's kind of got to raise the question as what the Labour Party actually offering nowadays. That would certainly be the question that Sir Keir Starmer, or indeed any future Labour leader, will have to answer.
How much of this is because British politics is like anywhere else? Like you've mentioned, the Tories have been in charge for quite a while. There's got to be just a fatigue factor with some of it just because they've been in power for so long. But like you said, you also have this dynamic of the post-Corbyn Labour Party kind of trying to figure out who they are. And then in these results, there's definitely something to be said. There's a bit of a rural and urban divide, as we would call it in the States, with some of these results. How much of this is, yeah, there's a fatigue, but the Labour Party is still going to have to come with some kind of a cohesive vision here if they're going to take the leadership?
Yeah, that's totally true. For the last at least 4 years, at least before the pandemic, the overarching issue was Brexit and Britain leaving the European Union. Had that referendum where the majority of the public said that we'd be better off being outside the trading bloc, that intergovernmental organisation, and the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn's reign, weren't standing for it. During the 2019 general election, they actually had in their manifesto that they would have a second referendum on the Brexit deal. So Labour would essentially go to the European Union in Belgium, negotiate a deal, and then have a referendum where they would campaign against it. And that hurt a lot of voters, especially in their traditional heartlands in the north and in the Midlands, who strongly voted to leave the European Union compared to London and the south of England. So that there's that regional issue, but Brexit is becoming less prevalent. It might be interconnected to things like the cost of living, the price of food, which has been skyrocketing. The Bank of England projects that inflation is going to be at 10% at the end of this year. And because of the way in which the Tories have mishandled the economy by, throughout the pandemic and now post-pandemic, Labour actually leading the Tories when it comes to trust, at least public polling, when it comes to trust in handling and managing public finances. So on the economic side, they do have a strength in there, and I could see come the next general election that they could just simply ask the question to voters, in any election video or during a debate: has your living standards improved under the Tories? And the vast majority of people would say no, and that in itself is a winning formula. It's just, could they incorporate that with a strong message for wider society, for promoting social liberalism, but also proving that they're a more trustworthy party than the Tories, who, like I mentioned, have been embroiled in issues around trust, that sleaze and sexual assault and second jobs. It's going to be tough ask. And also the Tories have an 80-seat majority in the House of Commons, and only once in history has a majority been slashed that big. So it's going to be a mighty challenge for the Labour Party.
Now they're talking about the Tories. Bill Bowkett joining us here on Heard Tell. They're talking a lot of policies here, but we're just kind of looking at it from the outside. You're there, you tell me, because of the COVID policies, because of the adjustments from Brexit, because of their tax policies that you already touched on, because of the NHS policies that they've been working on, fairly or unfairly, however you want to parse it out, they're kind of painted into the corner that they're going to have to fight out of. And I don't think they've got a lot that they can really do here, do they?
They have some legroom, I feel. At least when it comes to the economy, they can. Boris Johnson, should he be, the Conservative Party leader come the next election, which is most likely to be either 2023 or even 2024, then they would say, but we didn't have a war and we didn't have a pandemic, in our election manifesto. In that case, and as we saw with the Queen's speech, there's a lot of red meat policies which are going to be put through the Houses of Parliament over the next parliamentary year. We've got a big bill when it comes to regulating big tech. We have a very big bill, the National Anti Borders Bill, which is supposed to hung on illegal immigration. There's a deal agreed with the Rwandan government to send asylum seekers trying to enter the UK and send them to the Central African country. And many of these red meat policies are being proposed not only because they were in the Conservative 2019 manifesto and they have to deliver on them, otherwise they're going to lose, a couple, many votes. But it's also being seen and interpreted, at least by some politicians, as an appeasement from Boris Johnson over distrust within his own Tory ranks over the way he's handled the economy, his behaviour during the Partygate scandal, and whether he misled Parliament in the process as well. So when it comes to that next election, when it does come around, this is the pivotal question: is that the Tories have been in power for 12 years now, and they've got to ask voters and really appeal to them, because there are going to be some who are going to be apathetic, and many people aren't turning up to the doorstep as much as they were. Actually, the turnout in the local elections was just over 30%, which is an incredibly low number. It's half of what you normally see at a general election. So they really have to, the brand of Boris Johnson, along with the appeal of conservatism, modern British conservatism, has to stick. Otherwise, they're at risk of succeeding to the Labour Party, which to them would be a economic and a social disaster.
Because of what transpired before with Brexit, with the changing in power, with Boris Johnson's own rise to power, has it been a blessing or a curse that everybody admits, like, this general election is going to be out in the future? It's going to be at least another year in the future, probably. Is that a blessing or a curse to the Tory party that's trying to readjust on the fly here?
Well, there was one report I saw from Business Insider, actually, Kat Neelan, who heard from several Tory sources that potentially the Tories are eyeing up election this year. And the reason they're doing it this year is because they feel that the economy at this moment of time is not getting any better, with the MPS, as I mentioned, predicting that hike in inflation, hike in interest rates, resultingly as well, that if the state of the economy doesn't improve as they would hope, come 12 months time, then what's the point of holding off for a general election? I mean, that there could be the benefit for Johnson in putting behind some of the more personal Westminster bubble stories, as we like to call them, around Sleaze and Partygate, because as you're seeing with public opinion, I think in the most recent Survation poll, it showed still that a majority of the British people want Boris Johnson to resign, and that a majority see him as a dishonest politician. So that in itself could be an advantage, but then that would give also Labour the chance to make more ground. We've got some really important by-elections for parliamentary seats coming up. We've got the Wakefield by-election, which was caused after Imran Khan, a Tory MP, was suspended for sexual harassment, and then we've got another in Tiverton and Honiton by Neil Parish, an MP who was caught watching pornography in the House of Commons chamber. And that in itself will be a test. I mean, local elections, actually, as we mentioned, have more local factors involved in it. And the thing is that parties are able to concentrate all their resources into these different marginals and seats to gain the best advantage. But but I think the most realistic solution as date that we can see is probably going to be 2023. Wait till this Metropolitan Police investigations, Partygate, is concluded. Wait until the Durham police finish their conclusion, hopefully the situation in Ukraine improves, wait and see if any of the measures implemented by the Tory, like the energy rebate, actually has any impact on people's livelihoods, and see where to go from there.
Yeah, it makes that Keir Starmer promise even more interesting if that should go down. Bill Bowkett joined us real quick before we have to let you go. A lot of the threads that went through all of these issues we talked about, the economy, the leftover wake of Brexit, things like this, border policy, those are new spins on a very old problem, has risen since the Queen's speech. Northern Ireland is getting messy and it's getting loud. Just real quickly before we have to let you go, what's the results of that? How is that going to play? Because again, an old problem, a little bit of a new spin in it with Sinn Féin taking power in the Republic of Ireland. How's that going to play going forward?
Yes, we can't forget the other parts of the UK as well. Before we get into Northern Ireland and Wales, Labour increased their share of the vote. In Scotland, the Scottish National Party increased their share of the vote. So that in itself is going to raise further questions about a second independence referendum over there. But the big story, I feel, throughout the entire general election, as you said, is what happened in Northern Ireland, which is Sinn Féin becoming the largest party in Northern Ireland. So actually the first time that a nationalist party is the largest party in the province since Northern Ireland was created over 101 years ago. And there are far-reaching consequences with this, not only because the biggest unionist party who have been in power there for many a decade, the Democratic Unionist Party, are refusing to go into a power sharing agreement in Northern Ireland because unlike other democracies in the UK, where we have a majoritarian system, where parties with the most votes would then be able to rule, or if they lack a majority, they would have to be in coalition. In Northern Ireland, the different factions, the Unionists and the Nationalist parties, actually have to work together, and they have to reach consensus. But the Democratic Unionist Party don't want to do it because they see Sinn Féin as historically, the political wing of the IRA. They see that they're going to break up the union. You hear Mary Lou McDonald, the president of Sinn Féin, wanting a border poll, within the next 5 years. And then we've got this issue around the protocol, which ultimately the Sinn Féin support, but the DUP don't, because it's causing trade barriers between the UK, the Great Britain, as we know, or mainland Britain, and Northern Ireland. And we heard today that Liz Truss wants to scrap elements of the protocol in order to reduce bureaucracy, but also in turn respect the Good Friday Agreement, which is what has preserved peace in Northern Ireland over the last 3 decades. Just because they won the majority doesn't come. Actually, if you combine the different votes from the other parties, then unionism is still the largest bloc, at least among voters. But it's certainly going to put pressure on Boris Johnson. It's going to put pressure on the wider union, and it's going to raise further question as to Northern Ireland would be better off as part of the United Kingdom, or whether it would want to unite Ireland for the first time, in over a century.
Yeah, very interesting times. We're definitely going to have you back again to continue to cover this, because it's not going to get less interesting in UK politics. Our friend Bill Bowkett over in the UK, my friend.
All the music on Her Tell is provided under a Creative Content license from monstercat.com.